Good morning. We are doing our third lesson for Unit 7. Again, Unit 7 is the period of Reconstruction. As you saw in Lesson 2, Reconstruction does come to an end in 1877 with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes and the Compromise of 1877. So, what happens at the end of Reconstruction is the federal government removes their troops, the military that's located in the South, and now, without federal government oversight, the South is going to return to things as they were, and discrimination is going to be the name of the game. They're going to begin to pass things that are called Jim Crow laws. So, today, our lesson, we're going to be analyzing Jim Crow laws. We're going to talk about how is this even able to happen? How are we able to allow a total group of the population, which were Black Americans, to be this heavily discriminated against? So, we're going to look at the origination or creation of the Jim Crow phrase, understand how the South passed laws that acted as loopholes to the federal law, explain how the court case of Plessy versus Ferguson and the Supreme Court is important, and lastly, we'll look at some of the physical violence that was committed against Black Americans, predominantly in the South of the United States. So, who was Jim Crow? At the time, so we're talking the end of the 1800s, one very popular form of entertainment were called minstrel shows. So these were shows like little theater skits, and white people would put on blackface and pretend to be Black characters. And they were caricatures of Black people. They sang, they danced, they told jokes, they acted dumb. The joke was usually about Black people thinking they were on the same level as whites just because they were dressed up. But again, it was a character. And this caricature was not accurate. And the thing with Jim Crow that I want you to remember is like a lot of this is extremely offensive, and that's on purpose. So it's sometimes a difficult topic to look at and learn about, but again, it's important that we do so. So Jim Crow wasn't an actual real person, he was a character. But it becomes known as the phrase that's used for these discriminatory laws. So 1877, Reconstruction ends. So the South quickly writes new laws to stop Blacks from voting, keep Blacks separate from whites, and these laws become known as Jim Crow laws. So if you look at the left, okay, the two platforms, so this was a Southern poster. You have the Democratic platform, which is for the white man, and the Republican platform saying this is for the Negro. Again, looking at the images, right, all of this was exaggerated. They exaggerated and made fun of how they thought Black people looked. It was like cartoon characters. So, how could the South get away with this? Remember, after the Civil War, we passed the 15th Amendment, which says the right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So you can't be discriminated against to vote because of, if you're Black, or if you had been a slave. That would what the last part there, the previous condition of servitude. But the South passes laws that are kind of workarounds against the 15th Amendment. These laws targeted Blacks without mentioning them. Some whites were affected, but most all Blacks were. This way, Southern states could claim they weren't violating the 15th Amendment, but in fact, they actually were. They passed laws like grandfather clauses. So they weren't saying you couldn't vote because you were a slave, but they passed laws saying, well, your grandfather couldn't vote, so you can't vote. So that was called a grandfather clause. Obviously, any Black person living in the South, their grandfather wouldn't have voted because they were enslaved. They passed poll taxes. So you had to pay a tax to vote, which, if you recall from our last two lessons, in the system of sharecropping, that was not something that Black Southerners had. They didn't have access to extra money, so they wouldn't be able to afford a tax. Lastly, they passed things like literacy tests, which you had to prove that you can read and write. And I'll show you an example in our practice assignment of like what those literacy tests looked like. They were extremely challenging, even for white people, and that was done on purpose. When all else failed, though, if a Black person could meet all those requirements, South just turned to intimidation. Look at the picture on the left, right? They're holding up a man at gunpoint to convince him not to vote. So if you thought your life was at risk, most of the time you weren't going to vote and risk your life. So, How about separation? How did they keep blacks separate from whites? The 14th Amendment gives people citizenship. It also says that people cannot be deprived their property without due process, and that all people are equal under the law. So that last phrase there, the equal protection, that was meant to have blacks be equal to whites in the form of the law. So how did the South figure that out? How did they make things separate? Well, it all comes to a court case, okay, called Plessy versus Ferguson. Not going to play this video. I'll post the link to this video on the assignment if you'd like to watch it. But I'm going to explain what Plessy versus Ferguson was. Okay, so it was a case where the South had railroad cars that were separate. So you had segregation in the South. They made laws that kept Black people separate. In restaurants, in waiting rooms, in theaters, sporting matches, schools were separate, drinking fountains were separate, transportation, everywhere. So Homer Plessy was a Black man. He bought a first class train ticket, but was told he had to go to the Black car. He wouldn't, so he was arrested for breaking the law. He sued. He sued and said, I paid for the ticket. I should be able to sit in the white car. And they said, nope, you broke the law. You're Black. You have to sit in the Black car. um, he lost his case. So this let the South know they could keep doing this thing, and the law was on their side. So the case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules that as long as different races could access the same things equally, they could be separated. So they called this the separate but equal doctrine. This is in your notes. The significance of Plessy versus Ferguson is it passes basically separate but equal. So as long as you had access to a school, it didn't matter. It could be kept separate, okay? And that was the equal access. But was it? Let's be smart. Let's totally think about things. You have some pictures here of examples. The top left, you have water fountains, right? You can just see how they look. Not equal, but separate. Schools. Okay, the white schools were nicer. They got nicer things, nicer, books, newer textbooks, more space. And then at the bottom, you can see what the Black schools looked like. So separate but equal was not equal, okay? But the South said, the Supreme Court said we can do this. And, we're giving them schools, we're giving them dining rooms. Look at this top right picture. This is outside of a restaurant. This is the size of the dining room that, again, as I said, using these words, colored, okay, Negro, these were all phrases and words that were acceptable at the time that we would not use today. So, lastly, another thing that happened in the South was a problem of lynching. Okay, this was a form of torture. If a Black person tried to go against this racism that was in society, oftentimes they were murdered. Lynching would be a gang of white people that would capture or kidnap Blacks. Oftentimes they were hung publicly with lots of people watching. And white police, judges, and juries often refuse to punish whites for doing this. And this would be a system that existed in the South for almost 100 years. Things do not begin to change until the 1960s. You guys know who Martin Luther King is. You've learned about the civil rights movement. We'll learn more about the civil rights movement later this year. But think about this. This system of discrimination was in place until that time, which was only 60 years ago. So this is really an inherent issue with our society, was this systemized racism. And we're still dealing with this systemized racism today. In our next and last lesson of this unit, we'll be looking at some of the Black scholars that spoke out against this lynching and spoke out against this discrimination, like Ida B. Wells, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Booker T. Washington.